The roadmap is intended as a strategic planning framework that's going to enable colleagues within countries to achieve high quality inclusive education in Europe. And this quote that's on this slide is from the 2018 Council recommendation on how we might promote through measures to empower teachers, school leaders, et cetera, to promote active citizenship, transmit a sense of belonging, respond to the diverse needs of learners. And I'd like to just, suggest today that the roadmap can be seen as one of those measures. So what we're offering today will really align with these council recommendations. I also think that a key strength of the roadmap is in the underpinning research, which was a simultaneous consideration that was given not only to national policy frameworks, but also to teacher professional learning. And those two things, it's been kind of an iterative process in how we've thought about what are the policy frameworks saying and how well are people prepared to take up responsibilities that are in those frameworks. And in addition to that, we've got the cross-national learning that I know we've all been involved in along the way. I'd just like to also point out that within countries, inclusive education is often sometimes seen by many stakeholders as another form or an evolution of special education. And while there is something to that, particularly in lots of national policy frameworks, at a supranational level, it is thought of as something that's a little bit broader than a specific focus on what formerly was thought of as special educational needs. Now I'll come back to that as we go along, but I would just like to point out to you that within that 2018 Commission recommendation was also a list of children in vulnerable situations. And you see, quite a long list. And one of the things that list does, because that will not apply to a greater or lesser extent, depending on your national context. But one of the things that is important to point out is it implies that none of these things are unitary concepts. There's a lot of overlap there, and that the needs of vulnerable children within education systems occur, as you know, within a nested system. And I think that all of the stakeholders who are here today are going to probably be identifying themselves with one of these levels of, between the national level, the macro level at the top, and the micro level at the bottom of the slides. So, where inclusive education is operating on many levels, and the stakeholders at each level have important contributions to make. But the contributions that they make are easier to say than to do, in part because of the regulatory and other constructs that put parameters on how they operate within their professions or within the roles that they have at these different levels of the system. And it's also easier said than done because in addition to what I just said, we're also doing this work within a context where the topics that we're trying to, develop a linear roadmap to, a way forward are contested. And so sometimes the ways in which they're contested are incompatible. And that can happen at the level of, as I mentioned, stakeholders with different professional orientations, their training, their orientation, the way they think about vulnerability may be incompatible with the way another colleague with a different professional background thinks about it. And so we're starting, with real questions that we don't have clear answers to about whether special education and inclusive education are the same or different. Whether when we talk about pedagogical practice in services in schools, are we talking about some children or all children? How this all reverberates within the professional preparation of different service providers, and then how we work together. So there's lots going on here. And as a result of that, we know, and this is a slide I use a lot, so some of you may have seen it before, we have a policy goal that, and that was clear in our CSA reports. There are very clear policy goals, but a lot of unevenness in practice. And that's not a judgment. That's not a judgment on practice so much as it's just a reflection of the state of things. And it's not only in Ireland and Finland, but in every place. There's variability in practice. There's difficulty because of the contested nature of these concepts and knowing what constitutes good practice and consequently what counts as evidence. And what I'd like to argue today and suggest is that it is in those spaces where those contradictions and incompatibilities exist that rather than see those as barriers, that we look at those as spaces for transformation. This is our starting point. I just would like to offer a couple of reflections on what I see as your task. And my idea is to just kickstart the planning process and some of the dialogue that we'll be having in the breakout sessions today. The collaborative dimension, just a couple of points that you see on this slide. Working collaboratively will always present some difficulties because the difficulties themselves are related to the central features of the collaborative process. There are risks and rewards to collaborating with other people. The work will always be messy and incomplete. And that is not, I guess my argument would be that that is not a justification for inaction, but permission to keep working, to keep moving forward. We need to develop understanding of the difficulties that can arise and instead of, again, not treating them as problems, but seeking to improve our professional skills in managing them for constructively. That is the context for reform. Just as a starting point, when we come together, decisions have to be made about how we're going to work together. And it will be issues around time, issues around the kind of roles that people have, and there will also be issues around the lack of preparedness. And both Ireland and Finland have looked at professional learning as a priority area. So again, I hope we have lots of time to talk about that today. And I know from my own work that we talk a lot about collaboration and the need for collaboration in the inclusive education sphere. And when we in Scotland did an analysis of our own teacher education programs, we really identified that that was our weakest area. So, we talk the talk, but we also have to be making sure that we're walking the walk as we go along. We have to make decisions about how support is deployed in practice. I say on this slide decisions about the extent to which teaching decisions are negotiated, but really that's the wrong word. I mean, that's one word, but it might be placement decisions, it might be funding decisions, it might be resource allocation. You could replace this with any of the 14 areas that were included in your country analysis reports. And so, the decisions about the nature of a vulnerable child's difficulties, and the experience required to promote learning, links back, like our answers to that link back to that contested state. And again, and that's the place where people have to come together in this collaboration to be thinking about what can we learn together and how do we create a pathway forward so that we get the best opportunities, we make the best opportunities available for the greatest number of children. And where we go from here, is to recognize that these are sources of stress, and that we have to move. We acknowledge these sources of stress, but as we go forward, we move from sources of stress to professional learning because we recognize that good practice is flexible. And again, that's not to make excuses for inadequate practice or the status quo so much as it is to say it's flexible. What are we doing? How are we going forward? And part of that involves being self-critical about our practice and recognizing that it's developmental, it's fluid, it's not a point in time, that it's a process, but those processes are linked to something that's bigger than ourselves. It's really, they are linked to our policy, our national policy goals in terms of how we provide for all children within our national education system. In my view, the work of inclusion involves extending what's ordinarily available as opposed to doing something additional or different for some. I really think about inclusion in terms of all children learning together. Is quite a sociocultural perspective on learning. It focuses on the interdependence amongst learners, but also amongst ourselves as teachers and support services and administrators and all of that. And it's this focus on belonging. Like, that's the question we need to ask ourselves in terms of, meeting that standard of inclusion, does everybody in this form of provision, do they belong, or do they feel like they belong? Because we want to avoid the repetition of exclusion where provision is differentiated for some children to such an extent that they might be physically present, but are they really there? Are they connected in any way to the learning that's going on, or whatever it is that's happening with everybody else in that community? It really calls attention to that. How can colleagues work together to develop an understanding of the collaborative process and develop the professional skills to manage it? My answer to that is another set of questions that I hope that you will ask yourselves as you develop your action plans. Maybe some, this is the self-reflective, critical perspective reflection part of this, is that if we work in the space of tension and contradiction, what are the new ways that we can think about human diversity? How can we move away from just thinking of the problems of some children to the learning of all? What can we take from recent work in social learning theory about how people learn and how they learn together? Again, there's loads of work on this, and I'm sure many of you are more expert than I am in understanding that, but we can draw on that body of literature. And then having done that, what are the alternative ways of working with specialist knowledge? Taking account, because we have recognized the differences in our training and our perspectives, et cetera. So what does that mean for how we come up with new ways of overcoming what we would have seen as barriers in the past? So for me, the hallmarks of practice in knowing that we've met that standard is the idea of everybody, like when we're really thinking about everyone instead of most children, what we do for most children and what we do for some children. That depends on a rejection of deterministic beliefs about ability, and that the idea that, well, if we include some children, it'll interfere with the learning of others, that we'll be holding them back. What we need are ways of working, or the question we ask ourselves is, how do we truly respect the dignity of all learners as full members of a community, of a classroom, or other form of provision in terms of which we're working? And that, I think, takes us back to that teacher professional learning and the commitment to professional development. I'm going to end with this last slide that basically reminds us that collaboration is the heart of inclusion. I think that what my colleague Susan Hart used to say about teaching, everything a teacher does matters. Everything a teacher doesn't do also matters. And I think that's the thought I'd like to leave you with for each one of you in whatever role you're in, is what am I doing and what is it that I'm not doing? And how might I work with my colleagues to think about how we can work differently as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Lani. This was insightful, and the emphasis you placed in the principles, I think it aligns perfectly with the main idea of how we develop the roadmap. So thank you so much. You were just on time, so perfect timing. So now we have some time to take a few questions from you, from the participants. So you can use the question and answer function, or you can raise your hands. I think we have the possibility to do that. Questions for Lani then? Yes, maybe.
Hi, Lani. You spoke about identifying initial teacher education as a particular challenge in Scotland, and that I'm just wondering how you addressed that, and are you happy or happier with where you are now, and what those changes looked like in initial teacher education, and are you seeing the impact of that on classroom practice, particularly among newer qualified teachers?
Thank you very much for that question. I think, as some of you may know, we have a group in Scotland that represents all of the providers of initial teacher education, and we've been meeting together for more than 10 years now. It's an again, it's an organic group because people come and go. For myself, I'm an ex officio member of that group. I'm retired now, but I'm still very interested in what they're doing. And there are new colleagues coming on stream. But the idea is that even though our programs are different, the underlying principles of inclusion are the same. And we may operationalize them differently within our programs, but we still adhere to preparing teachers to meet a common set of standards that are provided by our General Teaching Council. And so we have a framework where we have identified a set of those teaching competencies that are aligned with the ideas of inclusive education. And we ask a series of questions we pose a series of questions that each provider can answer for themselves in terms of how are they going to meet that standard within their own programs. So when I mentioned to you the work that we did recently, where we identified collaboration as not our strongest area, was a self-evaluation that we did of, we developed our framework. We're very proud of it. We work together, we meet regularly, all these things. But how do we know that we're doing what we say we're doing? Okay. And so we did a little bit of an examination of our practice, and it was quite messy because we are all really different. And we do see that as an opportunity to learn from each other. But I think one of the things that really surprised us was that we did not give as much time to developing the knowledge and skills around the collaborative dimension, collaborative process that we would have liked to think that we did. So it was good for us to get that feedback for ourselves and take that back into our programs.
Thank you very much, Farin, for the question. Any other questions for Lani? Yes, Brendan.
Thanks, Anthony. And it's really to follow up on Maureen's question there, because this is system reform is massively complex. There's so many moving parts, and you have to bring everybody with you, all that type of thing. And you referenced in your answer structuring or making sure there was an approach with regards to the HEIs, the higher education institutes, and what they do and their programs and so on. But then to follow through into the classroom, which is ultimately where we want to get to, is there a particular mechanism in the Scottish system? In other words, is the inspectorate part of that conversation, or how can you ensure that it actually is happening beyond the program structure at the higher education institute level?
Yeah. I think that, and that's where the multiple stakeholders and working across the different components of your system, whatever that is really very important. Now, the inspectorate, that has come up in my own work. I can't speak to where they are right now in Scotland because I'm a little bit out of touch with what's happening with that link, and I know there's a lot going on in Scotland right now, so don't really want to talk about that so much as to say that that's a good space for that collaboration. And in my experience, there have been, in some national contexts, you have your principles of inclusion, or you have your teaching standards. There are gaps there in terms of the alignment, and then you have an inspectorate that comes in and has their own set of criteria for what would count as inclusive practice. And sometimes that would be incompatible with what researchers like myself would be arguing in terms of this idea of working with everybody and not differentiating to the extent that you're repeating exclusion in the classroom. And so that's an area where, and again, I don't want to speak for any national context right now, but that's a space where, there's likely to be tension, and it's something that you might want to spend some time thinking about. Does that gap exist in your own country? And if so, is there a way that you can bring people into a greater alignment in terms of how they make those judgments about what's happening? Because if differentiation, for example, is your criteria for whether or not a standard of inclusion is going to be met, in my view, that would be falling short because of the potential for the repetition of exclusion. I'm not saying that would automatically happen, but there's a risk there that you have to mitigate somehow. I hope that makes sense, Brendan. I'm not sure if I'm hitting the target there in terms of what you're asking.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks.
Okay, good.
All right. We have Frank.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Auntie. Thanks a million. Thanks a million for your for your talk there. Just a really quick one. I saw on one of your slides, and apologies if I'm paraphrasing, really were possibly follows on a little bit what you said to Brendan, where inclusion is the extension of what's there already rather than additional or the different. I'm just wondering if you could, that can often be where you have difficult conversations, I suppose, Lani, and I wonder, could you elaborate a small bit just on what you mean by that?
Okay, that's a really great question, Frank. Thank you very much for asking it. And I've written a lot about this over the years and spoken about it quite a bit. But, you know, essentially, I'm not saying good teaching is good teaching and just like put everybody together. I'm saying that my observation is that teachers are constantly, like, we're talking just at the level of the classroom now, and I realize we have other stakeholders here, and I think the principle, my work has been mostly in classrooms, so I'll stay there, but a lot of this can be kind of generalized. People are constantly taking account of individual differences between their clients, between the children in their classroom. It is tacit. It is, they do it, they just do it because of course you do. It's only when we've identified something as a difficulty or a problem that it becomes something that you need extra training for, that you know, it becomes something different. And again, I wouldn't argue that there aren't differences that need specialist support and attention. Of course there are, but it's the way in which we provide that support that matters. So when I talk about extending what's generally available, I'm talking about expanding our capacity to take account of individual differences in the way that we are already ordinarily do. But we do that with a wider diversity of children. And that becomes what I call not the what, but the how of the work. So it's not that we need a specialist support, it's the way we bring that into a setting and the way we deploy that support that fosters a sense of belonging rather than a reinforcement of division and difference. I shouldn't have said division, I meant to say difference, if that makes sense. And that's a very, you know, that's the 100-word answer to your question. I've elaborated on that quite a bit in some of the things that I've written, but I hope that makes sense.
Thank you so much for the question and the answer, Lani. I don't think we have time for more questions because we will, according to our program, we wanted to leave quite some time for the discussions, the more particular discussions in terms of the different countries. So thank you very much, Lani, for providing the background for the discussions that will follow.